Welcome back to A Moment in History. I'm Seth Udinsky. Well, when I was a kid, I was fascinated with medieval warfare, and I still am. I loved the idea of knights in shining armor riding atop a steed into a glorious battle, swinging a two-handed broadsword, taking down foes one by one. It's good stuff. Probably as much influenced by fantasy movies as by true medieval history, but you get the picture. Humor me for a second. Well, as a lover of pre-modern warfare, you can imagine my dismay when I learned at a very young age that this type of warfare died out at the end of the Middle Ages. Now, how did this happen? Well, on this episode, let's travel back to the end of the Middle Ages and explore the dawn of the gunpowder and warfare era and the death of medieval warfare. The story begins, at least in the West, with the Crusades. As the Christians were gradually pushed out of the Holy Land by the Turks, something else was happening, and that was this. The West was opening up trade with the Middle East and the Far East. The Crusades paved the way for cultural exports that had been in Asia for several centuries to make it to Europe, and one of these was gunpowder. Now, gunpowder had actually been in existence for several hundred years at this point, invented by the Chinese in the 8th century. But up until the later Middle Ages, it was used primarily for celebration and not as much for warfare until the invention of the cannon. Inventors looked at the catapult machines of siege warfare, which hurled large stones and fireballs at castles, and used explosives to fire these huge projectiles at far higher speeds and with far greater devastation. Now, Middle Eastern soldiers had already been experimenting with gunpowder weapons in the 13th century, but cannons did not reach Europe until the 14th century, and even then, they were unstable and seldom used. In fact, even well into the 15th century, the longbow and the crossbow were still the dominant projectile weapons in medieval Europe, with cannons and handguns used sparingly, if at all. Part of the reason for this was they were as dangerous for the people using them as they were for the enemy. One famous example of this, it was a cannon explosion actually, was in 1460 when Scottish King James II was killed when his massive cannon backfired during a siege in England. But in the later 15th century, cannons became more usable and the use of handguns began to grow as well, especially with the advent of the matchlock musket. Though it was for a very short time, there was a period in Europe in the 16th and early 17th centuries when it would have been common to see a fully armored knight wielding a handgun in one hand and a sword in the other. Finally, soldiers and knights began to realize that wearing pounds and pounds of heavy armor became increasingly obsolete and counterintuitive when most bullets and cannonballs could pass through even the strongest of plate armor with ease. So by the early 17th century, the traditional concept of medieval warfare was all but a thing of the past, though it should be noted that many of the tactics of medieval warfare, such as the cavalry charge, or claiming high ground, or siege warfare, and even hand-to-hand combat, would remain for centuries after, with some of these tactics even surviving to this day. Thanks so much for joining me once again for A Moment in History. Thanks for watching this video. For more content like this, make sure to check out some of the other videos we have on the channel.